Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the Minneapolis Ward 1 Virtual Candidate Forum hosted by Make Homes Happen. We are so glad to have you all with us this evening. My name is Asale Sol Young. I am the Executive Director at Urban Homeworks, a Make Homes Happen member, and I will be the MC and moderator this evening. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We are using Zoom webinar, which means you can see and hear us, but we can't see or hear you. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions you have for the candidates. They'll be able to answer your questions directly here in a bit. Finally, we are recording this webinar and we will share it on the Make Homes Happen Facebook page by the end of this month. As you all know, we have an important election coming up on November 2nd, in less than 2 months. All 13 Minneapolis City Council members and the Minneapolis mayor are up for election this year, as are all Parks Board members and 2 Board of Estimate and Taxation members. To see exactly who will be on your ballot, visit the Secretary of State's website on September 17th or later. For information about when, where, and how to vote, visit www.vote.minneapolismn.gov. Julia Hobart, who is managing our tech this evening, has shared this information in the chat. And thank you in advance, Julia, for your support tonight. We are so lucky to have you. Before we hear from our candidates, let me tell you a bit about Make Homes Happen. We are a coalition of community-based groups and organizations that advocate for affordable housing development, preservation, and tenant rights in Minneapolis. In 2017, we helped successfully push for a $40 million investment to the Minneapolis Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Yet even then, the housing needs of our community far outweighed the dollars spent. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated what was already a housing crisis, and we know housing is a critical issue in our city. City leaders have significant influence on the policies, programs, and funding choices that impact our community. That's why Make Homes Happen is hosting this forum this evening. In order to ensure the fairness of our election series, Make Homes Happen used a uniform process in communicating with candidates. We approached each candidate and invited them to participate in a Zoom interview about housing. The interview included 3 questions, and candidates had 2 minutes to respond to each question. We recorded candidates' answers and will play them back for you now as opening statements for this event. Note that we did not edit the content of candidate responses, but we did cut each answer off at 2 minutes. Anything that was said after 2 minutes will not be shared here tonight. This was done to ensure standardization across the interviews we conducted. Finally, candidates who did not participate in the Zoom interview will each have the opportunity to present a 2-minute opening statement live today. And in this case, our candidates were able to do the video interview. So we're gonna go ahead and hear from our candidates. Julia, will you play the recorded Zoom interviews for us, please? And we'll start with Elliott Payne in alphabetical order.
Affordable housing has been a priority in the last 4 years, and many policies and programs were introduced to address the housing needs of the community, some of which have passed and some are currently under discussion. Do you believe that the city is headed in the right direction when it comes to affordable housing policies? Please explain your answer.
Yeah, so my answer to that question really depends on which policies we're talking about. There's certainly some policy wins that we're celebrating. For instance, the city's new permanently affordable housing program. This program is meant to address the racial wealth gap head on by making homeownership possible for many low-income folks of color who would otherwise be excluded from homeownership and therefore generational wealth transfer. This program can begin to repair some of the historical harms that continue to negatively impact BIPOC families and while ensuring affordable housing stock for generations to come. And that's a huge win. At the same time, I think many of the housing policies currently under consideration may be heading in the right direction, but they're not nearly bold enough to respond to the scale of the crisis we have right now. For example, look what's happening with single room occupancy right now. We're in the middle of a serious housing crisis. We have neighbors whose best options are to live in an encampment, and that's just unacceptable. We should be legalizing SROs and other shared or transitional housing solutions and making them as easy to build and operate as possible throughout the city. But we don't currently have a council that's consistently and reliably progressive on housing issues. The conservative bloc on our council is slowing this process down and creating needless restrictions on where SROs can be built and who can operate them. And every delay there is means more folks being stuck in encampments and not transitioning into some of these solutions. We need much bolder investments in housing, affordable and public, and without a veto-proof progressive majority, we're not going to get there anytime soon.
Are there any housing policies that you think the city is currently overlooking and should be discussed? Please be specific in what policies or tools you would want to make sure are brought to the table.
So there are a couple of examples from other cities that I'm excited to pursue here in Minneapolis. One is Boston's move to combine zoning and fair housing, and the other is the city of Evanston's restorative housing program. Boston City Council successfully conjoined the city's zoning and fair housing requirements by incorporating affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements into the zoning code. Now, among other things, proposals for development are required to produce an assessment of the historical exclusion and displacement risk, including a review of potential racial and economic changes in the area where the project is proposed, and a review of the proposal's potential effect on rents in that area. Evanston's restorative housing program is a reparative program that promotes Black homeownership and wealth generation by providing funds for homeownership, home improvement, and mortgage assistance. These policies haven't necessarily been overlooked. They're innovative, and I'm looking forward to bringing bold ideas like this to the table while in office.
What are the practical skills and/or lived experience that you would bring to your role as a city council member that could be used to help address the city's affordable housing needs?
For the last 4 years, I've been leading community design at the Office of Performance and Innovation in the city of Minneapolis. In that time, I've learned a lot about how city government works and sometimes how it doesn't work. I have a really good understanding of the obstacles that get in the way of effective policymaking, whether that's because of a disconnect that happens between city staff and council, or because of the lack of cooperation between the mayor's office and the council members we elect to represent us. My expertise is bringing people together for conversations to get folks to consensus on serious challenges we're facing as a city. As the person who has been leading the community design work for the city, that's at the heart of everything that I do in my job. Helping people to work collaboratively across differences to arrive at solutions that will be better for all of us and everyday people who make Minneapolis their home. And I believe I can use the knowledge and expertise that I've gained in my current position with the city to help get things done for the people of Minneapolis. When it comes to my lived experience as a Black man who grew up in a segregated neighborhood, I know what it's like to live in a city where the policies were never designed for you. I know from my own lived experience what it's like to be ignored, or even worse, to be treated as if I am the problem by my government. And my goal as a council member is to make sure that our city policies are focused on those who are most impacted by the issues we're facing. Our government already works really well for some folks. What I want to do is make sure that our government works really well for everyone, not just the wealthy or the well-connected.
Thank you. We will now hear the recorded statements of Kevin Reich.
Affordable housing has been a priority in the last 4 years, and many policies and programs were introduced to address the housing needs of the community, some of which have passed and some are currently under discussion. Do you believe that the city is headed in the right direction when it comes to affordable housing policies? Please explain your answer.
Yes, I do, generally speaking, believe we are headed in the right direction. We have increased funding for production through our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I think it's a fund that's well managed to leverage outcomes well beyond our strategic investments. We, of course, in the recent years have expanded in two areas significantly that we probably were not as forthright or intentional about in terms of preservation of naturally occurring housing and also renters, tenant protections and support, I think are areas that we've expanded. And certainly there's even increased need in those areas too. We now have been challenged with, as many cities have, with increased situation in terms of homelessness and the need for support and transitional housing options in that arena that need to be more aggressive and more attenuated to those situations. So I think we, though we have a good solid baseline and have been moving our key areas in the right direction, even though it probably needs some enhancement. And I would also suggest that we definitely need to deepen our resolve around homeless transitional as we move forward. I would also suggest that we need to be strategic in the sense of not just passively supporting programs and people that present a challenge or an opportunity, that we should be making these opportunities as well. We also should make sure that other goals are being met through our housing initiatives and other goals that we do, like transit-oriented development, where two policies can come together to make something that's even greater with two resources. But that takes intentional planning. Also, in my area, up until a few years ago, we did not, in Ward 1, Northeast Minneapolis, north of Broadway, we did not have any competition, so to speak, in terms of market rate housing. Now, 3 projects now, 2 completed, 1 pending, are now competing with the land that—
Time. Are there any housing policies that you think the city is currently overlooking and should be discussed? Please be specific in what policies or tools you would want to make sure are brought to the table.
Yeah, I think one of the things, again, that we can enhance our efforts is being proactive and being aggressive in terms of site acquisition, identification and acquisition. And that can be done through inventory of available spaces in different areas, but it also can be something where housing efforts are automatically thought of as part and parcel of large other investments. For example, if you're doing a large project in partnership with the Department of Transportation or Hennepin County, or one of our major reconstruction projects, what opportunities are presented there in which we can get some development benefit by thinking about those investments in conjunction with other housing investments, particularly transit investment. We have some examples of that on Central Avenue, where we proactively secured property, have arrangements with the Department of Transportation in Hennepin County to do our part, the housing, their part, their projects, and bringing budgets together to make these available opportunities. Again, I think we also should we should, as a city, much stronger in terms of our investments towards the environmental initiatives that we have. The Hook and Ladder project, which is the country's first affordable housing project to a passive standard, is a fantastic example of bringing 2 policies together that are desperately needed for environment and also housing equity. The question is, do we have the tools to make that not an exceptional project, but a more common or even standard one? Those are the things I think we don't really have an answer to for now, but I do believe we'll be moving forward to make that a more standard thing. And of course, my familiarity with that project and how it came to be will directly inform how what was once exceptional will be standard.
What are the practical skills and/or lived experience that you would bring to your role as a city council member that could be used to help address the city's affordable housing needs?
Well, I have a long history in terms of community-oriented development of housing. Even in my previous role before being elected official as project director for a community improvement association in lower Northeast Minneapolis. It's the last remaining East Side racially concentrated area of poverty. And in doing those projects, we found many successes and learned many lessons, which inform a lot of my work as an elected and moving forward. Also, in terms of key roles, I've been on the housing committee ever since I've been elected. I've certainly proactively worked in my first term, and we had ongoing meetings with the consortium to go through our scoring system for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I'm actively engaged in housing funding policies at the state level. the county level and of course the municipal level. I work in those circles and draw upon those relationships and experiences. And also in terms of this proactive thing that I keep mentioning in terms of what we need to do moving forward to create more housing, particularly with a more aggressive market. We need to, I think, do more acquisitions that are tailored to our outcomes that we want versus just passively waiting for projects to come to us to be evaluated and funded. And this is true for affordable rental, but it's also true for our opportunities for preservation. And it's also true for our opportunities for home ownership, affordable home ownership, long-term home ownership with our partners. These will take resources, and those elements will come in the place of coordination. It'll come in the place of being proactive and strategic, and it'll come into just knowing what it'll take to get the resources to meet other goals, as I've mentioned before, in terms of environmental efficiency, which is very important, and transit-oriented development, which is very important. Those things actually do meet the bottom line for affordability. Everything you have to expend to do what you need to do as a person or a family goes to that bottom line.
Time.
Thank you. And thank you both for being with us tonight and introducing yourselves. We're now ready to move on to the next phase of our event, where we will hear directly from candidates in response to audience questions. If you're joining us today, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any housing-related questions you have for candidates. Make Homes Happen has prepared a few questions to get us started, and we will also read any questions submitted by voters in advance. To be fair, we will rotate which candidate answers first. Candidates, you will each have 2 minutes to respond to the question. We will time you and mute you at 2 minutes. Our first question. Describe one of the most effective policies, programs, or strategies that the city of Minneapolis could enact or continue to employ to support naturally occurring affordable housing in the market. And Elliott, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think when we talk about housing, we can really quickly fall down the rabbit hole of complexity when it comes to regulations and funding sources. But the problem is actually quite simple. It is we don't have enough inventory to meet the demand. And so there's this extremely high pressure for demand for housing, which is driving prices up. And really the only way to bring those prices down or to make them accessible to everyone who wants to make a home in Northeast is through direct subsidy. And I think one of the things that we need to acknowledge at any time when we're talking about housing policy, the crisis that we're in is at a scale that is much larger than what a municipal government can handle. And so we need to leverage the budget of the city to both be a catalyst towards investment, particularly when it comes to naturally occurring and maintaining that naturally occurring inventory. But at the end of the day, it's going to take direct subsidy from all layers of government to be able to make housing affordable for all.
Thank you. Kevin, we'll go ahead and start your time.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I think one of the recent developments could be very instructive for something that could be more applied citywide. And what I'm referring to is one of the poor landlords, and that's being very polite, lost his properties. I think he's now maybe doing prison time, Mr. Friends. And that was one problem that was sort of taken care of, but it created another. What were those tenants going to do? And I think the partnership that was developed with the Lake of the City's Land Trust, our city department, other players at other jurisdictions came together to figure out not only the goal of making those tenants have an opportunity to have stable housing that they were threatened to lose because of bad management, but also an opportunity to own and an opportunity to go even beyond those individuals into a permanent stock of reoccurring affordable housing. So really doing a 180 on that situation. I think there's a blueprint there that can be replicated as one really strong strategy moving forward. Of course, the fact that we actually are looking at naturally occurring affordable housing as an objective was something that wasn't really emphasized when I started. It certainly is a target now, and the different resources now are being applied in that area. That's a newer sort of effort. We need to expand it, and the example I just gave, I think, is really promising for effective ways moving forward. And I didn't get cut off.
Thank you. Our second question, and this question will start with you, Kevin. Do you think the city currently has adequate funding and policies to advance the production of new, affordable, and accessible housing stock? 2 minutes.
Thank you for that. Again, I think by comparison to other municipalities and even by our own past efforts, we are performing well on those measures. However, we now have to be measured against the need that's out there. And I think there's a broad concurrence by all who are participating in a forum like this that more needs to be done. And so to that end, that's why one of the things I bring up in terms of strategic advanced site acquisition as a new form of meeting our goals. In part, that's motivated by the notion that we now are in strong competition, a lesson that I well learned up here on the east side, where before we could methodically, every 2 years, have a really sound project that met a whole range of needs, sober supportive housing, affordable housing at different ranges, et cetera. We now don't have the comfort of that time. We now have to be in competition for the best sites, because the best sites actually not only provide an opportunity to build housing, but it provides an opportunity to build housing in the best places that meet people's needs, next to resources, so they're not living in a food desert, next to transportation so they can get to work, and actually being in places where work actually exists, like we have on the east side. All those things add up to the empowerment that comes from not only just owning a home and having safe shelter, but having access to the things that a person needs or a family needs to conduct their business. So that's where I think we need to go at the next level. Always can be an argument about more funding, but it should be well spent and strategically placed.
Thank you. Elliott, we'll go ahead and start your 2 minutes.
Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. I'm sorry. Do you think the city currently has adequate funding and policies to advance the production of new, affordable, and accessible housing stock? 2 minutes.
No, I don't think we have enough funding. Like I said in my previous answer, the scale and scope of this housing crisis is much larger than the city's budget, and we're going to need to rely on state and federal partners to be able to close that gap. But that doesn't mean that we don't have any leverage here. We have to put every policy on the table, whether that means raising a levy, using TIF financing, or even COVID release funds. Everything needs to be on the table for us to really deliver on the needs of the community that we have right now.
Thank you. And I just want to remind our audience that if you are joining us today, to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask any housing related questions you have for our candidates today. Moving on to our next question. And this question will start with Elliott. Consider what you know about cost-burdened and vulnerable renters in the city. What will you do as a city council member to improve or create systems and policies that improves the overall quality and accessibility of their housing options? 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll actually point to the hook and ladder project that Mr. Reich had referenced earlier. There are some successes in that project, but one of the challenges with that project is how long it took to go through the regulatory process of making that work. And it became an exceptional project as a result of the policy failures that we have. We need to be able to streamline those types of projects, because we can't wait 10 years every time that we want to get 10 more units for families that are struggling, whether they're on the brink of homelessness or experiencing an unsheltered life right now. And so we have to have much more direct action that can address the needs that are on the ground today, not the needs that are going to happen 10 years from now.
Thank you. Kevin?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Absolutely. Consider what you know about cost-burdened and vulnerable renters in the city. What will you do as a city council member to improve or create systems and policies that improves the overall quality and accessibility of their housing options? 2 minutes.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Yeah, there's of course two fronts of this, and obviously the need is pushing us to do more on both fronts. The first is, of course, the ability to produce the units that are needed at the prices that are needed for families to have access to them. And there's a whole range of income criteria and categories that we, of course, invest in. And as has been stated, we need to invest more in. Again, I would mention that one of our other fronts is to help people where they're at presently in what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. What supports do they have to deal with the situations that they're currently in and may be in if they move to other locations? And that's where our partners like Homeline and other socially networked groups with access to technical assistance, legal assistance, just being a guide in the woods, so to speak, for folks who want to basically deal with what they're dealing with now in the name of preserving their affordable options at this time and moving forward, expanding those efforts. And again, how do we expand those opportunities with the existing housing stock? I think there are policies afoot that we'll be working on with our partners like the Local Initiative Support Corporation to look at further goals to stabilize that naturally occurring situation, in addition to aggressive attempt to produce the housing that we do produce, which actually doesn't take 10 years. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question, and Kevin, we'll start with you. What is your position on the rent stabilization charter amendment that will be on this year's ballot, and your views enacting future rent stabilization policy within Minneapolis? 2 minutes.
Thank you for that. Well, it's very good that we have this on the ballot for consideration and local enabling, that it gives us that local control that allows us to actually explore different policy options. And it also gives us the time to do the due diligence and work to make sound policy based on a range of stakeholder inputs to get the outcomes that I think will be not only effective, but durable over time and meaningful to people that it's actually directed towards. And so we take great strength in the research capacity of our partners. We have a good body of work to start. We have good examples in other both municipalities and states. And I very much look forward to advancing a policy that will be effective, will be enduring, and have the outcomes that we seek. Look forward to that work and glad it's moving forward.
Thank you. Elliott?
Yeah, I'm strongly in support of the rent stabilization amendment. Renters make up more than 50%. They make up the majority of Minneapolis residents. And oftentimes our policies are really centered on supporting homeownership and leaving renters behind as though they're not contributing members of our community. And so not only do we need rent stabilization, we need to have just cause protection, pre-eviction notification requirements. We need much more renter protections provided to renters because they are meaningful contributors to our community.
Thank you. This next question will start with you, Elliott. With one of the largest racial homeownership gaps in the country, how will you work to create better pathways for foundational Black families towards affordable homeownership opportunities? 2 minutes.
I think a good starting point is to recognize why that is, and the fact that there have been policies that were explicitly designed with the intention of creating these disparities and creating segregated communities. My neighborhood, Audubon Park, had some of the highest density of racial covenants, policy tools designed to exclude people like me from owning my home. And so we need to recognize the intentionality of that historical reason that these disparities exist so that we can actually design policy with the intentionality to close these disparities. And so even the framing of the question almost leads to this expectation that the individual Black families need to somehow uplift themselves into home ownership versus the type of direct subsidization that had been created to create inclusive financing opportunities, or like I talked about in the video around the program in Evanston that had this restorative process of targeting financing so that Black families can own their homes. And so I think having policies that are designed with that intention explicitly is the only way that we're going to be able to reverse the explicit policies that created the disparities in the first place.
Thank you. Kevin?
Thank you for the question. And the very points that were raised in terms of past policies, certainly it was front and center of the 2040 plan that the city provided to the Met Council and has been approved. We looked the racially motivated zoning policies and land use policies square and center. And so that informs a whole range of issues that are contemplated in the comprehensive plan, including housing. I will point to two things that I think are really something to build on. One is the notion of who's actually building this housing for people of color and African-American families. Who's building that? Well, one of the programs we opened up in terms of our lots, we have an inventory of lots throughout the city, some in more areas than others. And we really did outstanding recruitment, I would believe, based on the outcomes of who's actually building this housing. Time in, again, when I'm on the housing committee and we're approving the sale of these lots, people of color are the actual builders of these opportunities for their communities, for the people that we speak of. And so it really goes to not just a charitable moment or notion, but an empowerment notion on both ends of the deal, so to speak. The other is lending. A big part of the past policies were motivated by realtors and lenders and what they wanted to do to operate. We can break that by creating a new set of lenders, just as we're now inviting and actually are supporting a new set of builders. And that, of course, is one of the projects I think has greatest hope is the Village Financial, which is a cooperatively owned concept for banking from North Minneapolis that, again, the people lending the money, the people building the homes, and the people living them can be one unified effort. We've got the elements of that. It needs to come together and be operational at a much greater scale, granted, but there's something to be built on right before us.
Thank you. Our next question, and Kevin, this will go first to you. How do you respond to someone who doesn't understand the complexity of the housing crisis? Someone who thinks is an individual issue and not a systemic issue? 2 minutes.
Wow, that would be quite an educational session. Housing is absolutely a systemic thing. It's based on financing, a system. It's based on construction capacity, again, systems. It's based on policies of support, again, systems. I mean, it's overlaid with so many systems that to deny that it's systemic is it's hard to even fathom. So I would just sort of start with that sort of overall viewpoint. The other would be to ask them if they are homeowners themselves, how did they come across it? Did they buy it like an apple? Or is there much more involved? Many hoops and groups to interface with the bank, the mortgage, the lender, the realtors, all those people are based on companies that are part of an industry, which are of course then part of a greater system. So even within their own individual experience, they can kind of think back to how they made a decision, but it wasn't really just their decision. Likewise for renters too, they know very well that they're in a system and they're reminded of that in sometimes very coarse ways with unscrupulous landowners who use their power in ways that we grieve and are making basically policies to remedy that power dynamic. You don't have power dynamics without systems that support them. And so again, I think an individual experience can very swiftly bring you out to how they got in their individual situation, and breaking that down reveals a system.
Thank you. Elliott.
Yeah, I think my approach to that would be the recognition that this system is complex by design, and starting from there as our starting point. Our housing system is born out of the neoliberal idea that free markets will magically take care of the needs of everyone. And I think that the first investigation of the dogma behind that reveals how much cronyism is within the housing market, how much complexity is intentionally added in to make it an obscure and opaque process to be a participant within the housing market. And so starting with some first principles around, what are the sources of cost when it comes to creating new units of housing? What are the sources of revenue, and how do people actually make money in this industry? And what are the incentives that lead to people to create complexity where there otherwise doesn't need to be complexity? And I think that would be how I'd approach it. So then that you can see that all these different players along the way are inserting complexity. That makes it so that at the individual level, it is now becoming an opaque, almost impossible system to navigate. And so that can help kind of shift this kind of individualized blame for not picking yourself up by your bootstraps to be able to, afford a down payment. If you can't afford a 20% down payment, then you don't deserve to own a home. Those are the kind of ideas that are out there that are ignoring that intentional complexity that's been inserted into the various interests that surround the housing market.
Thank you. And I'm just going to use this time to remind our audience and those who have newly joined us that we would love to have your questions, and you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any housing related questions that you have for our candidates this evening. Moving on to our next question. Describe your direct experience establishing, maintaining, and supporting varied and complex partnerships. How will you use this experience as a city council member? Elliott, we'll go ahead and start with you. 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think even just this process of campaigning introduces you to so many people, and the process of screening, just like we screened for this forum, that's introducing me to all of the various organizations and groups that are doing this advocacy work. I also had the benefit of working on a housing project while in City Hall. I worked with Councilmember Cunningham and Councilmember Gordon to amend the ordinance around conduct on licensed premises. And in that, we had to work with renters advocacy groups, and we worked with the community. We worked with Cura to create some protections for the Black and brown folks that were being targeted for evictions through this ordinance. And so not only that, lived experience at the staff level, working through these ordinances has given me an introduction to some of the organizations and relationships that are going to carry me into being able to identify these opportunities for collaboration. But even the process of campaigning has really expanded my network of people. And running a campaign that is so forcefully progressive when it comes to housing policy, renters' rights, has really introduced me to a lot of allies within this space that I think can really lead to a strong agenda once elected.
Thank you. Kevin.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, we certainly have a very strong network of nonprofit builders and advocates in this realm. We draw upon that. Before, the consortium was the old name for the group that collaborates together across different individual groups and different sort of areas of the housing, be it from renter protection all the way to affordable housing production. And so we draw upon that, always have, always will draw upon that amazing resource, which is the envy of many municipalities, to be quite frank, and allows us to produce what we do produce today. In addition to that, from a multi-jurisdictional perspective, it's always good to know what is needed and who's acting to create opportunities. One example where we worked for an affordable housing project would have happened without being aware of and in communication with, in this case, Hennepin County, with some property just off of Lowry Avenue, which now is supportive housing, deeply affordable, with social services around healthcare. And that project would have happened without, being very proactive with their inventory and looking at the opportunities to develop that. And so my office made the call, made the connections, figured out a way to work together between the two departments in each respective government unit, and got a project moving forward with those agreements. That's a pretty spectacular project. And there's a couple other examples like that where you can be proactive in the way that I keep mentioning, if you have those relationships and have that ability to deliver on that. Other examples, of course, as I allude to, the whole framework of how a living environment, not just the structure and its affordability or supportive services they're in, but what is the environment around it? And of course, there you're working with.
That is time. We do have to stick to our time limits this evening for fairness. Thank you for that. This next question, we'll start with you, Kevin. How will you work collaboratively with community groups and nonprofits to support the creation of affordable housing? 2 minutes. Apologies, Kevin, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. As mentioned, being proactive and having established working relationships in advance of any particular project, I think is important. So when opportunities do arise, you can very swiftly take advantage of them. Several projects in Ward 1, and I think in Minneapolis, broadly speaking, wouldn't have happened if it weren't for those standing relationships in advance of any particular project. And so I think that type of relationship will deliver, and I think I've already given examples previously. And furthermore, I would suggest that having conversations where how we deliver on our scoring and funding can be continually renewed. We shouldn't have to have a sort of way of doing it with lots of communication and partnership and then not hit the reset button for 5 years or so, or even more. We should be able to replenish that, renew that in a collaborative way, in a way that we did when we set up the current system that we have for continual improvement. And I think that's some work to be done.
Thank you. Elliott.
Yeah, I think it's really important, especially when it comes to collaborating across multiple organizations, is to have clarity of purpose and clarity of principles. And I think that's going to be my starting point, because by inviting groups into this process with clear goals and clear outcomes, that allows people to self-identify the opportunity and start the collaboration. And like I said in a previous answer, I've already started the process of building the relationships with a lot of these organizations. But one of the things that these organizations need to see is a champion within City Hall that is going to actually follow through on some of these goals and some of these values. And so I think having a really strong stance of what kind of outcomes that I'm fighting for is going to be kind of my invitation for all of these organizations to work collaboratively with me.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question, Elliott, we'll start this one with you. How has the market failed to provide housing for low-income families? 2 minutes.
Yeah, and this goes back to my statement about kind of this concept of the free market taking care of everyone's needs. We have to define what the free market is, because between the the housing code of ordinances and the sources of financing, there are a lot of different levers on this market that really don't make it a free market. And so one of the things that I see as a failure is that just the simple cost of building some of these projects leads developers to have to build at the higher end so that they can get a return on that investment. Because particularly for the middle class needs, there's this missing middle. We can get projects like Hook and Ladder that, you have to be a developer that has pretty unique skill set in navigating regulation and bureaucracy and fairly sophisticated financing vehicles to be able to get that project done. But it can happen for those more affordable units. The free market's not really taking care of the middle class. The first house that I bought in Northeast, I paid under $200,000 for what's now considered a starter home. That recently sold for $240,000 this last year. And it's an 800 square foot home that is, you could have a toddler starting a family there, but not, much more. Maybe back in the day when there were 6 people living in there in the 20s, that worked. But the free market is not filling in the needs for every level of our community, especially that missing middle for those working class and middle class families that need something a little bit more than a 2-bedroom apartment, but can't afford, some of these brand new constructions that are happening that the free market is building because they get a solid return on that investment.
Thank you. Kevin. Sorry, Kevin, you are still muted.
Sorry. I think it's pretty well known that the market is there to do what the market is designed to do, which is to make return on investment. In that very singular quest, of course, societal needs as defined by society and the needs that are presented to it may not be met. As a matter of fact, oftentimes aren't. And I think that's, economics 101. So market failure is definitely the zone where governments and or nonprofits fill the gap. It's sort of the liberal system that we have. So it's not surprising that that's the situation that we're in. In terms of how we work with the market, one of the ways, aside from doing our own publicly supported affordable housing production and or policies that protect renters in place, this notion of what can we do to perhaps liberalize it where the market could be more accommodating in terms of the price points. It's hard to dictate what materials are. I've not known a policy for that, nor labor costs, and nor do we want to have too many shortcuts on that, given that we're a strong labor and union city. So the 2040 plan in part addresses it with greater ability to produce and where you can produce. Some of it was in the name of social justice and rectifying past practices. Some of it is in the sense of just law of supply and demand. I think that that's a good basis, but it's only in part. We still will need to be, again, strategic and have to have a commitment to be supportive of other production types. And I think that's where our focus will have to be in terms of different product types, as we have let more different products be built, which should have some positive effect on supply and demand.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. There have been multiple encampments in Ward 1 over the last year. What have you done as a council member, or what will you do if elected, to support people who end up in encampments in your ward? Kevin, 2 minutes. We'll start with you.
Thank you. I think two areas that are strong examples of how to address encampments. One would be Logan Park as a community, both the community group, which was a great forum to address the situations and issues from different perspectives. Some community members being concerned by the situation, other communities want to be supportive of people in need, and to actually have an honest forum, I think was quite laudable, and productive things I think came from those conversations. In addition, local partners and supporting those local partners. In this case, we had people who were outreach, people who themselves were previously unhoused doing that work. And we, of course, supported them, uplifted them, and applauded their efforts, in addition to supporting them more directly through policy. Also, local institutions. The churches were very strong component with that particular example, and that had great benefits. That, in addition to linking them to other resources, particularly through the county and some of our own resources, we're able to secure, in that case, the ones that were the organized participants in that encampment found transitional temporary housing and have been, for the most part, not 100% processed into transitional living environments and homes. And so that's a good success story. The other would be just the fact that we had a specially trained lieutenant who really cared about homelessness, who could go into situations that weren't the sponsored ones, but sort of the roaming RV encampments. In some cases, we just really needed to know what was the situation there because we didn't have go-to outreach people. We were able to get those interviews through traffic enforcement and our own housing resource people and links to social services to have positive engagements in that situation, able to get some successful transitions in those cases, and then others moved on. But nonetheless, very positive engagement because of that coordination between several different departments and a jurisdiction.
Thank you. Elliott.
I think it's important to recognize that a lot of the folks that choose to live in encampments are making a very rational choice based on the best options for themselves. And this is kind of a reflection of, these multiple policy failings across every level of government. That shelter isn't the best place for some of these folks. Sometimes they have pets that they're trying to care for that are not allowed in shelters. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is recognize that there are organizations that will have a much more authentic connection with these communities, and we need to fund those organizations to be at the front lines to help start the process of getting some of these communities into transitional housings, and also working with transitional housing solutions that can better accommodate some of the unique needs of some of the folks who've decided that the encampment is the best place for them. And so I think it's going to require working really closely with our county partners, possibly even state partners when we're thinking about longer term housing needs. Like I said, part of the problem with encampments is there's just not a high enough supply of housing to meet the needs of people, so they're getting displaced into these encampments. And so there's a short-term need for doing direct funding of service providers that have an authentic connection with these communities. We should be using city dollars to fund that. And then there's a long-term need of making sure that we find long-term homes for these folks and fund the development of those homes.
Thank you. Moving on to our next question. Are there any developments in zoning policy that you would support to grow further affordable housing options within our community? And Elliott, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Yes, the 2040 plan is a very good start when it comes to zoning policy. The removal of single family zoning across the board is, something that we all should celebrate. And we're national leaders when it comes to that. But where the rubber meets the road is a lot of the housing code actually doesn't match the 2040 plan. And so although anybody could build up to a triplex on any plot within the city, the housing code of ordinances hasn't really been updated to reflect that. And so the site plans that would be needed to build that density would go through a lot of regulatory barriers to being able to get this density built. And so I think one of the things that we need to do when we're thinking about zoning is pairing zoning with the housing code of ordinances to create fast tracks for some of these projects, because one of the big challenges is that every one of these projects has to go up to planning review and it has to go up to public comment. And at every step along the way, there's an opportunity to either add cost to that project or even completely derail it altogether. And so I think that we need to develop some housing code that is paired with the 2040 plan and those zoning updates, so that any plan that meets this fast track criteria can get built. And I think that will go a long way towards getting to the affordability that we need in our community.
Thank you. Kevin.
Well, as noted, the 2040 plan sets out an extraordinarily aggressive framework to be more enabling of the type of housing that needs to be produced, particularly in the name of inventory, which would be both market and supported. I would have to mention that I'm on the work group that's actually writing the zoning code of ordinances as we speak. One of the first things we did was knocked off some of the regulations around housing up to 4 units, more to be done. Of course, it's a comp plan. The zoning code addresses many different issues beyond certain types of housing, and we have knocked off some of it. We probably have 21 things to do. We probably are a third way through, and hopefully we'll wrap it up within a year or so. And that's not untypical. You create the plan, it gets approved by the different levels of government, and then you go and proceed to make the legal documents that reflect that, and that work is happening. And I would say is quite synchronized to these ends. Furthermore, I would suggest that in terms of fast track, we have to be careful. These check-ins, as it were, aren't just sort of nuisances. It's to actually make sure that the fire marshal ensures that it's up to a certain standard for safety, that actually the engineering elements of it are actually up to standard. Fast tracking can, for those who remember the dream homes were slapped up. They were going to be a great savior of our economy. They turned out to be a fiasco, and many of them even been torn down. So there's a reason why we do have some check-ins. I do believe in fast tracking for those projects that are unique and have impediments that meet other goals. We're doing some work and learning around that with pilot projects in terms of the names of energy efficiency, more work on that to come. but our pilots have been rather fruitful. But even there, they still have to go through the checks that are expected to have a safe, stable, and appropriate housing in our community.
Thank you. As a city council member, how would you approach increasing the city's effectiveness at consistently growing and maintaining affordable and accessible rental and owner housing stock in the city? And Kevin, we'll go ahead and start with you. Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
As touched on before, we have a pretty strong system of partners. We have a pretty strong system of policy guidance and fairly robust funding by most standards. However, as we've identified, the need is outpacing our ability to deliver, and we'll have to match that and be commensurate and very clear about that. I would also suggest that we need to be proactive in our competition in areas where we haven't had the same competition with the marketplace, because they will choose the best locations by any definition, not just from our marketing brochure, but for how people, what they might enjoy, or actually what some people actually need. And as I mentioned before, that's a whole range of things. Energy efficiency is another set of bills. Do we have the production capacity to do that and a commitment to do that? Ability to get to work without having to have the expense of a car or multiple cars. Do they have that proximity? Are they in an area where services can be met rather readily? Walk to a place where you can get your taxes done and go and get your groceries and that sort of thing. Walk to schools. Building homes where families can live next to schools, very important. That level of coordination, we have pieces of it. It needs to be sewn together in a more comprehensive way if we're going to get the outcomes we want in competition with the marketplace, which is aggressive in areas that it hadn't been and can move rather swiftly.
Thank you. Elliott.
Can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. As a city council member, how would you approach increasing the city's effectiveness at consistently growing and maintaining affordable and accessible rental and owner housing stock in the city? 2 minutes.
Yeah, I think the more kinds of housing we have, the more people will be able to make homes here. And the key word that I hear in that question is consistently. And one concept I've been thinking about is just how costs get added on to these projects, whether it is a single family home, a triplex, or a multifamily project. And these costs, like I said, are multiple steps within the process of approval. I think that one thing that we could do to create consistency here is really encourage sharing of site plans, sharing of development plans, and especially for developers that are utilizing the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Anybody who's accepting city funding that's helping to offset the costs, I think they should make some of their site plans open source so that other developers could utilize those plans. And maybe that first build through does go through all those checks and balances, but once that process has been cleared and that development has been completed, we should open source that process, not only the site plans, but the steps that they had to get through the regulatory framework so that that can be replicated over and over again.
Thank you. Our next question. Will you work with the City Council to identify a dedicated source of annual funding in excess of $50 million to aid the production, preservation, and protections needed to produce sufficient, affordable, and accessible housing for residents of the city? And as that's a longer question, would you like me to repeat that? If not, Elliott, go ahead and 2 minutes.
I mean, I'm reticent to commit to dollar numbers, but the need is so great that 50 million maybe isn't even enough. And so an easy commitment to make is, fighting for every dollar, because I do feel like this is one of the most urgent needs that we have in our community, and it's really holding the city back. The growth of our city has far outstripped the capacity of the city to build to the need. And so whatever that dollar amount is, we need to fight for each of those dollars every step along the way.
Thank you. Kevin.
Well, 50 is a nice clean number. Let's just call that a reach number. And I wouldn't mind putting that on the table and see how close we get to it, or even have the opportunity to surpass it. My goal has always been to have a continual trend line where we increase our budgetary commitment, where we increase our ability to leverage outside resources. And we have a great team of staff who I think are quite masterful in that front. So keeping them on board is probably key as well. And the ability to look in different areas to widen our ability to address different needs. Again, as I mentioned, getting in the areas of rental protection, recognizing that existing stock is something to be preserved and can have outcomes to those ends. But in the name of production, I'm willing to push that envelope. I always have. 3 different mayors. I don't think I've ever said, oh, that was enough. I always would push for more. Sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. Sometimes there's colleagues that start in one place, and then we, of course, have a full budget where competing resources are met. But I've always been on the side of tipping the scale towards more for housing. The trend line's pretty true in that remark. And as we already know, the problem is commanding us to even go further. I'm very willing to be on that journey, as I have been in the past.
Thank you. Our next question, we'll start with Kevin. In accordance with growing more affordable housing on high density corridors, where do you see these opportunities for growth in Ward 1? 2 minutes.
Well, embedded in the question is the answer on our high and mid-frequency corridors. And of course, part of the equation is how do you get your high frequency corridor even have better service like Central Avenue, which we're working on, and have successfully secured dollars. And how does that affect some of the east-west connections, like the 32, the 30, et cetera, as part of the package. But more directly, so once you've identified those areas and of course endeavor to enhance or improve the ability for those corridors to actually function well, how do you get the properties? And as I mentioned, the way we've gotten them in the past is being proactive. I'm very keen on the lay of the land, have been trying to find strategic locations well before I was an elected official, and will continue with those insights moving forward. At least half the projects were not passively found. They were identified and secured well in advance of just waiting for something to come our way as a city. So the opportunities are now underutilized property in those corridors, of which there are several. If you see an empty parking lot, imagine an affordable housing project, mixed use depending on the adjacent area and the zoning, but don't imagine space, imagine a place. And that's been a goal and a track record that we have in Ward 1.
Thank you. Elliott.
Yeah, I've lived just off of 28th and Johnson for over 15 years. And there's this city-owned vacant lot that's just sitting there on 28th and Johnson that's just crying out for a multifamily unit. There's a lot of areas where we do have the capacity to build higher density, especially along these transit corridors. And I think that whatever is holding us back from developing those sites, we really have to work through that because the need is urgent, especially on transit corridors.
Thank you. And just another reminder to our audience to go ahead and use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions. Our next question, we'll start with Elliott. Do you see areas of opportunity within the city's approach and scope of oversight of rental housing through regulatory services? If so or not, what and why? 2 minutes.
Yeah, regulatory services is our eyes and ears on the ground when it comes to housing. They are the inspectors that go out and, flag missing paint jobs and other, deficiencies with properties. But they're the eyes and ears seeing where our housing is at. We could be better utilizing reg services as a way of, identifying opportunities for improving our naturally occurring affordable housing, using reg services as one of the pathways towards unlocking city funds for property improvement. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and that would be one of the places that I would start, especially with how close and connected they are to every single home in Minneapolis.
Thank you. Kevin.
Could you please repeat the question?
Absolutely. Do you see areas of opportunity within the city's approach and scope of oversight of rental housing through regulatory services? If so, or not, what and why? 2 minutes.
Well, regulatory services has, of course, they provide a very important service, as many people are familiar. And I would suggest one of the things before we call upon them to do more is to probably give them more capacity to do what they're already charged to do in their ability to go through the amazing amount of inventory that we have existing, and because we're an aggressive growth city, creating. There's just a level of capacity there that I think we have to be mindful of before we get too creative. But it's true, coordination between different staff people and sharing information to the extent that it's not happening now or could happen more robustly. I'm always intrigued with those conversations. As a matter of fact, I was part of the team that looked at the former regulatory services framework, which was this sort of behemoth that became sort of a thing unto itself that we broke up into working units. I think these are the kind of things that had positive effect that need to be revisited. Are those working units still the relevant ones? And what about those working units could lend themselves to other objectives? Part and parcel of the improvements of the past certainly can build on for next step things as identified.
Thank you. Our next question will, of course, start again with you, Kevin. What is your position on a tenant opportunity to purchase policy, also known as TOPA, for Minneapolis? Based on your position, what impact do you think it will have on residents who live in rental properties? 2 minutes. Oh, and you are muted.
Well, the impact will be to determine, but I think the proposition has one potential impact that can be very powerful. The opportunity to own is a powerful opportunity with many benefits that follow from it. And certainly if it's directed in areas where communities of color, where the gaps are in that area, this could be a vehicle for that, particularly if we have the wraparound services that would go with it. I draw upon an analogy when we did intentional communities, which allowed more unrelated people to live in one structure than had previously been allowed. Two things. One, we enabled it for good reason to better utilize the housing stock we have and provide affordable living options for a particular subset of living conditions. But what we also did was we relied on a handful of willing partners in the nonprofit support world and actually in the cooperative housing world to be part and parcel of how that policy was created and how it be implemented moving forward. So in effect, to be a part of that project, and I would similar thing with TOPA, you would sign up not just to take advantage of the opportunity, but take advantage of this wraparound service that would most likely provide opportunity, technical assistance, and perhaps even a better assurance as someone or people would be going into a whole new, very complicated enterprise of ownership that we wouldn't just let them be on their own in that respect. And so I think we can draw on that parallel. Those, of course, are the details that get designed and vetted when you create the policy. And so I, of course, very much look forward to that work as I have in the past.
Thank you. Elliott.
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely. What is your position on a tenant opportunity to purchase policy in Minneapolis? Based on your position, what impact do you think it will have on residents who live in rental properties? 2 minutes.
Yeah, I support TOPA for sure. And the goal of TOPA is to give renters the first right of refusal if their landlord decides to sell their property. And so the biggest renter protection here is to avoid displacement. I'm out talking to voters every day, and I'm currently talking to voters who are concerned about where they're going to live because they know that their building is getting sold and they don't have any idea who the new owner is going to be, what their intentions are, whether or not they'll be able to keep their lease. And all of that uncertainty is avoidable with a policy like TOPA. And I think that that is a sensible renter protection that we should absolutely support as a city.
Thank you. Before this next question, I just want to let folks know that this next question will be our last question for the evening. And Elliott, we will start with you. The final question: outline 2 to 3 steps you will take to cultivate constructive and effective working relationships with city staff, other city council members, and the mayor.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate in my role in City Hall to have had the pleasure of working across a lot of different departments. In fact, every department I've worked with, and a majority of council I've got really good working relationships with. And I just like working with people. And I think that actually goes a long way, is you actually have to have good personal relationships with folks. And I have the pleasure of saying I've got some really strong personal relationships in City Hall. But we also have to have not just be personable in our relationships. We have to build trust by following through. We have to build trust through integrity, saying what you mean and meaning what you say, and following through in your commitments, and being honest with people when there's tension or conflict, and using conflict constructively rather than as something that leads to some sort of ego hurting defense. And so every single challenge that we're facing right now as a city has significant trade-offs that, you know, have many constituencies on opposite ends. And I think that we cannot avoid that conflict. We have to lean into it and productively work through it to get to the types of solutions that are going to really deliver on the needs of our community and on our constituents. And I have a very good track record of navigating conflict and getting to outcomes. And that's demonstrated in the work that I did, getting the mental health response team launched along with my team in the Office of Performance and Innovation, as well as getting the Conduct on Licensed Premises Ordinance amended through the work with Councilmember Cunningham and Councilmember Gordon. And so I have a track record of working through multiple layers of the institution. I've got really good relationships within City Hall, and I'm looking forward to building on those relationships.
That is time. And Kevin, your response, please.
Thank you. Well, I think I have a pretty strong record, if not reputation, in terms of being collaborative. It's not my middle name, but it certainly is my very upfront approach, and has been consistent over quite a stretch of time with a body of different players. It's been more than one mayor and one body of colleagues. It's also been different department heads and different sub-managers that you interface with over time. And I don't think that I'd be able to find myself on the different planning subcommittees that have set up many of the major policies, the Transit Action Plan, the 2040 Plan, to just name a few of the biggest plans that the city's put forward, to be on those actual steering committees if I wasn't participating in a particular way or had something to add to the group dynamic, as it were. Similarly, I find myself representing the city in other areas, Metro Transit, their Transit Advisory Board. I chair other commissions that have taxing capacity in the name of environment and water quality. Again, I'm on all of those executive committees and planning committees as well. Again, in part because of what I have to offer and who I represent, but also in part because I find myself in a workshop sort of way and can't wait to roll up sleeves with different people, even with different perspectives, to get outcomes that benefit community in an immediate way, and hopefully with policies that are enduring and beneficial over time. I think that would continue. I would suggest that for those who aren't as familiar with my work or how I play well with others, you can always call me directly or ask others as well.
Thank you. That wraps our questions. Thank you, candidates, for participating in our event this evening. It's important that voters hear directly from you about the issues that matter, and we are grateful for your time and willingness to talk about affordable housing in our city. For candidates who would like to do so, please go ahead and share in the chat an email address, or contact page for voters to follow up if they have any additional questions. To all those who attended this event, thank you so much for joining us this evening. If you have any other questions related to affordable housing, you can contact candidates through the information they're sharing in the chat right now. Be sure to follow Make Homes Happen on Facebook at Make Homes Happen MPLS. As well, we will share a recording of this forum on our page. We will wait a couple of minutes for candidates to share their information before we end the call, but we hope that all of you have a wonderful evening.